Hello, everybody in Malaga. You'll be delighted to know that it is raining in London. I'm going to try and share my screen now, so hopefully you'll see this presentation. There we go. So this is the start, and this is my first slide, which is me in Malaga in 2019 with my son George in the middle and my wife Kate, going to see a football match. George is wearing the Malaga shirt. So this talk is called "Low Culture is the Best High Culture," and so what better place to start than your wonderful football stadium and your branded crisps. These we thought were fantastic. The crisps and the stadium and the footballers were like beautifully tonally arranged, like a Picasso. Well, we'll talk about Picasso a bit in a minute, but this amused me, and we had a lovely time, a wonderful time in Malaga. We came with this festival, La Semana Santa, and the Tonos, and again this interesting mix between high culture and low culture, historic culture, contemporary culture. And it was an extraordinary experience for us to enjoy in Malaga. And then we saw this again, which was, I think this was at the Pompidou. I think it was at the Pompidou. And again, this is a contemporary work drawing back on ancient works. It touches also on modern works, and it just seemed to me to speak to this idea of what is high culture, what is low culture, and who gets to decide. And then, of course, there is the pottery in the fort, which brings us back to Picasso and serializations. And this, I suppose, pottery is the most interesting area to look at the gap between high culture and low culture, because ultimately pottery is made from the most basic material on earth, which is earth. It's made of mud, and then with the human imagination it becomes something beautiful and specific and unique. And so pottery, I think, is the greatest metaphor for the human imagination, that it shows how you can take a base material and through nothing more than ideas create something extraordinary. So this is the Beatles in 1963, and you can see four young men. It goes Paul, George, Ringo, and then John Lennon. And then standing next to John Lennon, standing between John Lennon and Ringo Starr, is a guy called George Martin. And George Martin is the producer who discovered the Beatles. And what is interesting about George Martin and why he is specific to this talk is that George Martin trained as a classical musician, and he worked for a record company, Parlophone, and his job was to produce classical musical records. But in his sometimes he produced records with comedians just for fun. So he'd move away from classical music and he'd produce records with comedians, famously with Peter Sellers, the actor. And the Beatles sent in a tape. They sent a tape to lots of different music companies, and everybody refused them. And George Martin didn't think their music was particularly good, but thought, well, he'd like to meet them. And when he met them, he really liked them, and he thought they were very funny. He didn't think they were very good musicians, but he thought they were very funny. And so he decided to work with them. And so he took what was their arguably low culture. These were just young men, working class men from Liverpool in England on the northwest coast of England, who were basically untrained, and he married them with his extraordinary sophistication and training in a conservatoire, and he created perhaps the greatest band ever known in popular music. And what is interesting is when I interviewed George Martin on the 50th anniversary of his working with the Beatles, I asked him, what did he think was better, classical music or pop music? And he said to me that there are actually only two types of music. There is good music and there is bad music. And I think he's absolutely right. There's no high art or low art. There is good art and there is bad art. And I think that is the discussion: is what is art, and what is worthy of a position in the canon in our museums, and what is not worthy. And that is a discussion which has been alive and moving for many years. And you could almost date it back to 1863 and this is a man called Charles Baudelaire, who was, you'll probably know, an art critic and flaneur who lived in Paris, who was a great friend of many artists. And in 1863, he wrote an essay called The Painter of Modern Life. In 1863, of course, Paris was at a changing point in its life. They'd had revolutions, of course. Industrialization was upon the city. It was in a moment of great flux and ferment. And at the time, the art world was very old-fashioned. The Academy had very clear rules and regulations and standards and methods for making art, and the subjects that artists were allowed to choose. And Baudelaire challenged this and said, actually, it is no point painting mythological figures or great figures from antiquity or history. We need to be painting modern life. If you want to be relevant as an artist, the artist's job, he argued, was to capture the reality of the lived experience at that moment in time. Basically, he was talking about everyday life. The artist needed to capture everyday life. One of his great friends was the French painter, the realist painter, Edouard Manet. And he listened and read Baudelaire's article and decided that he must do something in this vein. Manet was a great friend, a great lover of the art of the past. He admired the great Renaissance paintings, specifically the Venetian Titian, and he loved this painting, the Venus of Urbino. And this, of course, is a very famous Renaissance painting in which you have this innocent, naked figure reclining in the foreground. Behind her is her maid looking out her wedding dress, for which she's about to be married, that the roses in her right hand are there to signify her great love for her future husband. The dog at the end of the bed is to signify her great loyalty and faithfulness to her husband. You'll see that the screen behind her is brought quite close to the picture frame to give a sense of depth of field towards the back. So Manet looked at this painting and studied this painting, both its content and form, and provoked by Baudelaire's argument that he must paint everyday life, produced this picture, which is called Olympia in 1863. And this is his modern take on Titian's Venus. So Titian's Venus is a great goddess. Olympia too harks back to ancient mythology. But Manet's Olympia is quite different to the goddess presented by Titian. His was a faithful woman who looked away into the distance. Manet's reclining nude is a prostitute. Olympia was a name given typically to the prostitutes of northern Paris in the 1860s. This is a friend of his. It should be noted that Manet died of syphilis, so I guess you have to be careful about who you hang out with. But this is maybe you could argue the first great modern painting where Manet has reduced pictorial detail to create an overall form and atmosphere that the maid who was picking out the wedding dress in the picture by Titian is a maid bringing flowers from a grateful client to the prostitute Olympia. She doesn't hold any roses. She just holds a choker around her neck to suggest her profession. There is no loyal dog at the end of the bed. Instead, there is a black cat to suggest the darkness of the night. And the way the black cat is responding suggests that she's looking directly at the male gaze. This painting was made for the Academy in 1863, and the male gaze was known to be the order of the day. Men went round the Academy and judged these paintings to be good or not good. And this woman is directly confronting the men of Paris, and the cat is suggesting that they are entering her room. So this was an outrageous painting. It was considered to be disgraceful and disgusting. And actually, Manet lost a lot of credibility. And it was only after he died that Monet, his great friend Claude Monet, bought this painting on behalf of the French nation and eventually gave it to France, and it's only ever once traveled out of the country since. So this is where low art starts to meet high art, where a prostitute becomes a goddess via Titian, and art changes forever. And so we move to Cezanne, who starts to paint pictures using binocular vision, and starts to focus on the still life. So typically the lowest form in the hierarchy of painting. It comes beneath mythological and religious painting, beneath landscape, beneath portraiture. The lowest form is to paint still lives. But Cezanne wanted to paint images that were truthful to how we saw, which was with two eyes, not one eye. So he dispensed with the idea of mathematical perspective and made paintings that looked at the image both from the front and from the top at the same time, which involved tipping up the tabletop to bring an image. So it started to come closer to the picture plane, and the illusion of the three-dimensional box of air starts to disappear. So Cezanne starts to bring common subjects to the history of art and challenges the methods of making art with a low subject, which is then, this is painted in 1905, but Cezanne dies in 1906. There's a massive memorial exhibition to which many artists went. Perhaps most frequently was Picasso, who called Cezanne the father of us all. Cezanne dies in 1906, and Picasso produces this famous painting in 1907, a year later. And so much of this harks back to what Cezanne was doing, but also the message from Baudelaire imploring artists to paint everyday life. So again, like Manet, Picasso's 5 female figures are prostitutes. They are from d'Avignon, which is an area of Barcelona where the prostitutes hung out. He has 2, a bowl of fruit at the front, like Cezanne, and his fruit is suggesting sexual pleasures these women might offer customers. But it's so much of what this painting does, although it was highly unpopular and not shown at the time and didn't really become famous until MoMA bought it in 1937, and many people thought Picasso had gone mad, is it takes a common subject, a subject from everyday life, from low culture, and it transposes it into the format of high culture, and drawing on the ethnographic museums of what was perceived as primitive art from the continent of Africa in very dismissive form to create those masks that he's using, as well as looking at this image from 2 dimensions and then 3 dimensions even. So here we have this collision of art and low culture and high culture, which created great reverberations around the art world, such as Picasso couldn't show this picture when he first made it in 1907, or even 10 years later. It was only 20 years later, this idea of such low culture, such a low subject, treated in such a way, could begin to be considered to be fine art. Which of course leads us on to cubism and the work that Picasso and Braque did together. Again, picking subjects from everyday life, lowly subjects, so cafe tables, glasses of wine, violins and candlesticks. And these images were all about trying to respond to what was happening in contemporary culture, not only the response to the camera and the fact that humans see with binocular vision, but also the work that Einstein had been doing around the theory of relativity and about what we know and space and things operating in space, but also by being honest about that a canvas is two-dimensional, and yet here we are trying to present a three-dimensional subject on 2 dimensions. And so each hard line represents a different perspective. So Picasso does this, and then these pictures with Picasso and Braque become harder and harder to read. They become illegible. Neither artist wanted to be an abstract painter. And so in 1912, Picasso does this, and this is an extraordinary moment in art. It's the first time this notion of collage is introduced into this world of fine art. And so to give their painting some sort of legibility, Picasso and Braque started to add letters, words, to give a sense of what the painting was of. So here you are looking at the top of a cafe table, a glass top of a cafe table. The chair is being pushed underneath the glass top, so you can see through the glass top to the chair caning. The word joue for journal has been written there by Picasso to give a suggestion of what you're looking at. And through it, you can see the chair caning. What is extraordinary about this particular image is that the chair caning has not been painted. It is actually a piece of drawer lining that Picasso has taken from his studio, from the drawer in his studio, which was just a piece of worthless paper. You might have used it to wrap a present or to use it to line a drawer, but it was ubiquitous and it was worthless. And by moving it 2 feet from his drawer, or 2 meters from his drawer to his canvas, Picasso has fundamentally changed the value of that piece of paper. It was worthless and ubiquitous. He moves it and puts it onto his artwork, and it becomes unique and valuable. So the whole way we see that piece of paper changes. But it couldn't be a lowlier piece of art. It couldn't be something worth less than a piece of paper which was lining a drawer. So this notion that everyday life isn't just depicted in an artwork, but everyday life becomes the artwork, that something that is recontextualized, that something which was just ordinary is contextualized to become extraordinary, changes art in a way that changes the world. So what could be more important here is that the low art is so much better than the high art, that this work would not have been possible without accepting the potency of low art. And so, of course, 5 years later, we have this. And the idea of serialization begins. Duchamp very much reacting to Picasso and the notion that anything from the everyday life can be brought into an artwork. So he goes even further by taking something anti-retinal, something which was ugly. This was during the First World War, of course, so why shouldn't art be ugly? That he chooses something which is ready-made, that already exists, that is not being made by an artist, but has been chosen by an artist, and recontextualizes it in the framework of an art gallery, of a museum, of an exhibition, as opposed to being something which is functional and utilitarian. So here we have the lowest thing you can imagine in contemporary culture, a urinal, a toilet, being recontextualized as something which is seen as very high culture, art, in an art exhibition. This was to be shown in the Armory, although it never was. And this fundamentally changes art, not only by asking the fundamental questions of why does art have to be beautiful, or why does art have to be made by an artist, or why does art have to be unique? None of those things this piece is. But it fundamentally changes art by saying that the medium is no longer more important than the message. So up until this point, an artist had to use canvas or panel to paint on, or to carve wood or marble. And that so in up until this point, the medium was more important. The medium had to be chosen, and then the idea is expressed on that medium. Duchamp is arguing the message is more important than the medium. So first of all, he chooses what he wants to say, and only after that does he select the most appropriate medium with which to communicate his ideas. And so at this point, anything can become art. Duchamp is wanting to communicate ideas around beauty, ownership, uniqueness, and the value of art and what is art. So this moment changes everything. Suddenly, low art has become high art. Even more than that, low art has become the best high art, because Duchamp's urinal leads to Dada, surrealism, situationism, alternative comedy, punk rock. It changes society fundamentally. So a banana strapped to a wall in an art gallery is suddenly worth hundreds of thousands of pounds. It is a banana. It's worth nothing. It is strapped to a wall with a bit of cheap tape. This is by the artist Museo Picasso. It's a serialization of an object. And having spoken to Museo Picasso at length many times, is his art only works when it's placed in the art gallery. So this idea that the lowest versions of culture can become high culture simply by repositioning them, simply by changing the context, simply by moving something a few feet, that something of the lowliest nature can be treated as something of the highest nature. But not necessarily only in a gallery. This is a stencil image by the British street artist Banksy, who has used low art in low places in a way that has created conversations that resonate around the world. This particular work, Kissing Coppers in 2004, challenges notions around sexuality, who is in a position of authority, what police officers are allowed and not allowed to do, what sort of human beings they are. But what's so interesting about Banksy's work is it's the opposite to what Picasso did and Maurizio Cattelan did and Duchamp did, is he doesn't need the gallery to make his point. In fact, he goes to lowly places, on old scrubbed out walls, on derelict buildings, and places his work there and uses that as his canvas. So he's doing low art in low places, which has a profound impact. If you asked people in the United Kingdom who Banksy was, almost everybody would know. If you asked people in England who Damien Hirst was, almost nobody would know. So here is an artist using a low art form, street art, in low places, rundown buildings, derelict buildings, that has the capacity to connect with millions, perhaps billions of people around the world. And if art's purpose is to communicate messages, to challenge convention, to move us, to help us see, then who is doing that better than Banksy in this day and age? Again, low culture, perhaps being the best high culture. I won't dwell long on Marina Abramovich, but the natural extension of anything being art, whether it's a urinal or a banana, is your body become the medium for the artwork. So here she is with her then partner, both lover and art partner Ulay, creating a work where these British people, very awkwardly, as only British people would do, are trying to walk between a naked Marina and a naked Ulay. And that is the art. The art is the individual's discomfort. Whereas many years later at the Museum of Modern Art in 2012, Marina did this work called The Artist is Present. And what could be lower than literally no art? So the only artwork taking place here was Marina sat at this table for 8 hours a day for 3 months, and the chair opposite her was empty. And anybody, you would have to queue up to sit opposite her, and you couldn't talk to her and you couldn't touch her, but you could just convene. And the art was the air in between you. that bit of space between you was created. And the Museum of Modern Art weren't sure how many people would go and see this work. They thought maybe a few thousand. In the end, just over 1 million people, just under 1 million people went to see it. People queued up all the way up Fifth Avenue. Some people would sit in that chair for a few seconds. Some people would sit there all day, which really annoyed all the people in the queue up Fifth Avenue. But what could be more profound? If you go on YouTube and you look at these videos of Marina doing this, what could be more profound than deciding that art is the spiritual connection between human beings, but is something which is completely invisible? That art is simply a feeling or a cue. This is Roman Ondag, who invites actors to form a queue at a closed door. They are queuing for nothing. You couldn't do anything more every day than stand in a queue. And people walk by and they join the queue. This queue is just actors pretending to queue for something which is not happening at a door which is locked and is never going to open. And this, this brings art inside and outside the gallery. The gallery is not available to them, but people will stand and join this queue thinking there's something to see. So this is an everyday act, a lowly act. The most boring thing we all do, which is to queue for something, is turned into an artwork with a profound message about what we do and how we think and how we respond as a society. This is an artist in Lithuania, in Vilnius, who's using a crashed car to question the war in Ukraine and the NATO summit, which happened in Vilnius 20 years ago when George Bush came and visited. This is another Lithuanian installation of actually about climate change, which won the Venice Biennale in 2019. And again, an extraordinary work where the performers aren't artists, the performers aren't even actors, they're people who are willing to spend 8 hours pretending to be on a beach, just hanging out and not inside a gallery either, in doing something as lowly as leisure time on the beach and trying to get a suntan. But I wanted to finish with this man and this notion that low culture really is the best high culture. This guy you might know called Theaster Gates is an African-American. He was born in Chicago. He's the youngest of 9 children. He's got 8 older sisters. He did very well at college, and he went to university in Chicago, and he eventually became a teacher at that university, a teacher of town planning. And at weekends, he liked to spend his time making pottery. He had a potter's wheel and he made pottery. It wasn't particularly great, but he enjoyed it as a thing to do, as a hobby. And every month at a county fair, he'd go and sell his pottery, and maybe it'd be a bowl for $4 and a plate for $5 and a mug for $6. And sometimes people would come and haggle and say, Theaster, we like your plate, but can we give you $3 for it, not $5? And Theaster felt that he had made this work with his hand, his head, and his heart, and he didn't really want to haggle, and he found it degrading. So he decided actually to stop selling his work at county fairs, and instead he decided to have an exhibition of his pottery in Chicago, in not a very big space at all. But he didn't say it was by Theaster Gates. He actually said the pottery in this exhibition was by a Japanese master called Soji Yamaguchi. There is no such person as Soji Yamaguchi. It's a completely made-up name. He made the name up by conflating two real things. One was Soji Hamada, who is a very well-known Japanese ceramicist, and Yamaguchi, which is an area of Japan where the ceramics is taught. He put those two names together and figured the Americans wouldn't work it out, which of course they didn't. So he has the exhibition, and the amazing thing is all his work sells, and nobody tries to haggle a cent of any of it. And what's amazing is that he wasn't selling it for $4 or $5. He was selling the items for $400 or $500. And it was extraordinary. And he even had a backstory on the wall for Soji Yamaguchi, saying he was a Japanese master who came to America to work with a black clay of Mississippi, fell in love with an African-American woman, went back to Japan eventually to show her the village in which he was brought up, and then tragically, but very conveniently for Theaster, died in a car crash. So he has this exhibition, and eventually the art world finds out Theaster Gates made this work and not somebody called Soji Yamaguchi. And they walk up to him and say, Theaster Gates, you are fantastic. And he said, oh, am I? That's great. And in fact, the art world say, Theaster, you're an artist. So Theaster was thinking, well, I make bowls and plates which aren't very good, but okay, I'll take that. So he decides to leverage this idea of being an artist. And he buys an old house on the south side of Chicago, which is a very rundown area of Chicago, which you probably know. And he does what is called a gut rehab. So he takes all the rubbish, all the rubble out of the house. And instead of throwing it away like you and I might do, this lowly material, this garbage from the house, he starts to arrange it in formal ways to create what he describes as artwork. So he took an old hose out of the basement, and well, I'll show you. And he put it, oh, there's Theaster. That's Theaster making his pottery. And here's an old hose he found at the bottom of this shack he bought, which had just been lying there for empty, derelict for decades. He found this hose, he recoiled it, he put it against a bit of a drawer at the bottom of a drawer he found, and he made a frame out of the balustrade. So this is all stuff he was chucking out because he was doing up the house, but he decided each one of these objects, a bit like Duchamp's urinal, they had value, they had a story, they had context. So this is literally junk. He's making art from junk. So he puts it all together, he makes a formal arrangement like this, and he sells it for $150,000. And he does it again and again and again, doing more and more what he calls gut rehabs, taking a derelict house, doing it up. Here's one he's done here, as you can see, all along the south side of Chicago. He takes the rubbish out, he turns it into formal objects, he sells it to rich people. He said he can't believe how wet rich people get about his stuff. He then uses that money to do up the derelict house, to then hand it over to the community, which is 99% African-American, as cultural centers. So he's got the Black Listening House for music, he's got the Black Filmmaking House for filmmaking, he's got one for reading and other cultural centers in and around the south side of Chicago. He's worked with the Mayor, Rahm Emanuel, who was Obama's running mate, and he's transforming one area of the Chicago, leveraging what he calls this notion that he is an artist and the value of art, and using rubbish, literally rubbish from these buildings, to create artworks to sell to rich people to regenerate a very poor area of America. So the artwork isn't really the thing that he's selling. The artwork is the thing you're looking at, the buildings, the cultural centers that he's creating. So this couldn't be a better example that high art is not nearly as interesting as low art, and that low culture is in fact the best high culture because it can transform the world. It takes the artist from a position of maker to activist. And I leave you with this, which is from your very own museum from Picasso. In art, intentions are not sufficient. We say in Spanish, love must be proved by facts and not by reasons. What one does is what counts, not what one had the intention of doing. So for me, this sums up the work of Theaster Gates, that it is his work that counts, and it is the everyday life that counts. And it is when art is able to do what Baudelaire demanded in 1863, when art is able to connect everyday life with the privileges and platforms and positions of high art, that together the world can be changed. And that is why low culture is better than high culture. Thank you.